The question is, as on the order paper, and I call Marie Goldman.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I was out knocking on doors in my Chelmsford constituency in last year's general election campaign, lots of people reminisced with me about a previous general election where the Liberal candidate came just 378 tantalising votes short of the incumbent Conservative. They spoke very fondly of that candidate, which might not be so surprising, apart from the fact that that election, the one that they were recalling, was in 1983, over 4 decades ago. I also remember speaking to an elderly, lifelong Labour voter who was lending me his vote for the very first time because, well, he had to do something different. When I thanked him for placing his trust in me, he told me not to take too much from it. You see, his entire life he'd never voted for a candidate who'd won. I think I'll always remember that conversation. Well, we'll see about that, I said as I walked away. You see, until last July, the constituency of Chelmsford, in its various shapes and sizes over the years, had never been represented in Parliament by anyone other than a Conservative for 74 years. In fact, it had been 100 years since Chelmsford was last represented by a Liberal, something I'm now extremely proud to have corrected. But the point is that it shouldn't have to be this way. I hugely admire the tenacity of that erstwhile Labour voter who lent me his vote, hoping against all the evidence of his lifetime that this time his vote might make a difference. But honestly, no wonder turnout in elections is often so painfully low. Our antiquated first-past-the-post system can be incredibly demoralising. Even for a committed political campaigner like myself, believe it or not, I really don't actually like having to ask people on the doorstep to lend me their vote, so that together we can game the system and get the change that we want to see. Wouldn't it be better if people could cast their vote in a way that let them set out their preferences, to know that all wouldn't be lost for them if their first preference candidate didn't win, that their vote could be transferred to someone else, that they also wouldn't mind seeing elected? Turnout in last year's general election, as has already been alluded to, was 65.9% in Chelmsford, slightly better than the national turnout, which was a pretty poor 59.7%. In Manchester Rusholme, the turnout was just 40%. But these are dizzying heights compared to the turnout in local elections.
I appreciate what she's talking about, but she's talking about a preferential voting system rather than a proportional voting system. So does she understand there's quite a big difference between those two options she's putting forwards, and obviously today's debate is around that proportional representation?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention and his question, but I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think there are preferential systems which can lead to proportional results. So, and in fact, we see those in other places, in many places, in fact, which do use preferential systems. But we should refer to the election in May 2024 for Essex's Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, where the turnout was barely 25%. So why aren't people voting? Surely part of the issue is at least that they simply don't believe that their vote counts. They don't believe that they can make a difference. And while I don't completely agree with that, I certainly agree that first past the post makes it harder. And there are other things that also make it harder. And I don't think we should be talking about changing our voting system without also talking about the other things that make up our electoral system that contribute to making things harder. And one of the things I would point to is voter ID. The introduction of voter ID was supposedly designed to enhance trust in our elections, but the evidence suggests that there have been some other consequences. In the 2024 general election, 4% of people who didn't vote said the voter ID requirement was the reason they couldn't. Additionally, 0.08% of those who went to the polls were unable to cast their ballot because they didn't have the correct ID. Now, these may seem like small figures, but if we put those into rough numbers rather than percentages, with about 28.9 million people casting their vote, the number of people who showed up but couldn't cast their vote because they didn't have the correct ID was approximately, unless I've got my maths wrong, 23,000 people. 23,000! That is an incredibly high and quite shocking number. Just think about that for a moment. So 23,000 people couldn't vote because we wanted to stop voter fraud. But of course that might be a good idea if there were lots and lots of voter fraud going on. But according to the Electoral Commission's website, their own website, it says, and I quote, "In the past 5 years there is no evidence of large-scale electoral fraud. Of the 1,462 cases of alleged electoral fraud reported to police between 2019 and 2023, 11 led to convictions, and the police issued 4 cautions." Talk about a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Voter registration is another area where improvements are needed. Research shows that as many as 8 million people across the UK are not registered correctly at their current address. This affects key groups, such as young people, private renters, and recent home movers who may not realise they're missing from the register until it's too late. While the current system allows for late registration before elections, this puts unnecessary pressure on electoral services and risks leaving some people unable to vote on polling day. So we can see the impact that even small barriers to voting can have. Imagine what would happen if we broke down and got rid of those barriers. I believe we must recognise that barriers to participation, including voter ID, voter registration, and of course the voting system itself, are dangerous to our democracy. I urge the government to take the opportunity to fix this and thereby to strengthen democracy and democratic engagement in our country.